Holy God, what are you showing me? His head. Come on.
The Last of Us is finally here, and yeah, wow. A quick side note on spoilers, I will talk about everything that's happened in the first 2 episodes, but I'm not going to be spoiling anything from what is going to happen from here on out. So if you haven't played the game but are watching the show, don't worry, you're safe in this video. Anyway, I'm honestly a little blown away by how good this show has turned out so far. Again, so far, this could evolve into one big dumpster fire and go off the rails, but given how strong this series has started, I just don't see that happening, to be honest. We're a couple episodes in now, and normally I'd wait until the show has finished its run before I make a video on it, but I just couldn't with The Last of Us because this show is doing something incredible. Now let me preface this entire video by saying I have played both Last of Us games and I love them. In fact, I played both recently back to back within the space of about a week. The first game, which season 1 of the show is based on, is a masterpiece in every sense of the word. It's an incredibly simple story on the surface level, but the crux of the game is within the characters and the relationships they form and the changes that these extremely flawed and damaged characters go through, and how characters like Joel rediscover their humanity. That's where the magic of The Last of Us comes from. Yeah, the world is cool, but it's nothing you haven't seen before, but the characters, Joel and Ellie, are everything in this story. And as we know, the first season of The Last of Us, which of course brings us to this video, is covering the entire story of the first game. And then the next season will go on to the events of Last of Us Part 2, presumably, which is the most polarizing game I have ever played. I don't know whether to love that game or absolutely hate it. There were things in Part 2 that, yeah, I mean, if you know, you know. But there were things on the other hand that made me absolutely love it. Never had I played a game that had me so conflicted in my life. Moral of the story, I'm a massive fan of the game, so naturally I was incredibly excited for this show. I mean, Pedro Pascal going on a journey across dangerous lands with a child as cargo. Sounds really damn familiar, doesn't it? The trailers for this show looked great. Elements of the world looked like they were copy and pasted straight from the game, and you could tell which character was which pretty easily from just trailers alone, and it looked super faithful. But the thing that got me really excited to see how this show was going to turn out was because of Craig Mazin, the showrunner, who of course was behind HBO's Chernobyl, which is an absolute masterpiece, and you can see elements of what made Chernobyl so effective front and center in The Last of Us. Not to mention, Craig Mazin is actually a massive fan of The Last of Us and played the games several times. Take note, Halo showrunners. If you actually liked the source material, you might have made a good show instead of a documentary on Master Chief's ass. Not to mention, Craig Mazin would actually be working alongside Neil Druckmann, who created The Last of Us. It was also set to have a budget that rivaled Game of Thrones. So this thing was destined for greatness from the start, but from what we have seen so far, has it lived up to the hype? Can it break the video game curse? Has it added to the masterpiece that was the first Last of Us game? Let's get to the bottom of that. The first episode of this show is one of the best and most compelling episodes of TV I have watched in a long time. Look, this pilot had endless amounts of pressure on its shoulders and was going to have to pass a pretty high bar to get fans on board. It was truly a make or break opening episode. If this didn't land, this show was done before it started. But not only did it clear that bar, it soared so far above it that I was genuinely surprised. This was one of the best and most suspenseful first episodes to a series that I have ever seen. Despite the fact I knew what was going to happen, I couldn't help but feel this sense of incoming dread mixed in with surprise of what I was seeing. Like I was genuinely surprised with detours they made from the source material. And at no point did I feel like any of the changes were unnecessary, because not only did they manage to pull off replicating exact moments from the game with various scenes being virtually identical, but it managed to strike a balance of doing what the game had already done, but also adding more around it, in some areas actually surpassing what was in the game. Now, it was well known that this show was going to be cutting a few things from the game, but also adding a lot more as well. One of the most notable omissions from the game is spores. Now, this isn't a spoiler because spores aren't going to be in the show, but spores were essentially an airborne way to become infected, with spores being common in areas littered with dead infected. And I really like what the spores brought to the game, but obviously again, no spores in the show. I didn't originally like this when I first heard about it, But after seeing the first 2 episodes, I am completely fine with spores not being in the show.
In the game, it spreads through biting and saliva, but it also can spread through the air, through spores. While that works in a video game environment, in real life, spores move around everywhere. And it's just harder to buy into the notion that spores localize and don't spread.
This is just highlighting that Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann have thought long and hard over what to keep and cut from the show. It is working, and they've made the right decisions so far. But let's dive into the nitty-gritty. Let's get into the specifics of the first episode, because there is just so much here that we could just dive into. Now, the game obviously starts pretty much as Joel and Sarah have their exchange on the couch, which we of course see in the show, but what we didn't get in the game was the 10 to 20 minutes of character work before that, which the show has just gone and done, seeing Sarah go to school, more of the dynamic Joel and Sarah have, even Tommy gets a scene before the outbreak starts. This was a perfect addition to the source material. It fleshed the world out pre-breakout. The opening interview scene is a perfect scene in the context of people new to The Last of Us. This was an expertly done scene in that it creates a real-life connection to the outbreak. Most post-apocalyptic shows with zombie breakouts are usually the exact same thing. Test subject escapes military facility, boom, zombie outbreak. But this show introduces cordyceps, which is a real-life fungi that affects ants in real life, but poses the question, what if that affected humans? What if this very real thing affected humans? The answer? The Last of Us. It's a smart way in creating a real-life connection with the outbreak in the show, which just makes things even more terrifying knowing that this is a very real thing, and if it found a way to infest humans, this is the grim reality that we could face. It was a perfect way to start the show and added something that wasn't explained in great detail in the game. It's a prime example of the show adding something to help increase the power that the source material already has. That's something that we see a lot of in this show, especially when it comes to the characters. The show fleshed out more of Joel, Sarah's, and Tommy's relationship, so when we go through the gut punch of Sarah's death, we feel it so much more than we would have otherwise. Take nothing away from the game showed what it needed to for the medium, and it worked perfectly for that. But when adapting to a show, you get the chance to do more. Most video game adaptations don't do that. They're so insistent on paying homage to the game that they forget that video games and film and television are not the same thing. How we connect with characters is different. How we as the viewer invest ourselves in the story is different. In films and shows, it's much more of a passive experience where things need to be shown. In a game though, it's more hands-on, with the gameplay obviously bridging gaps between cutscenes. It's an active experience, as opposed to the passive experience of film or TV. Mazin and Druckmann knew that and finally done what so many video game adaptations failed to do. And it's a major reason as to why the first episode was so effective. The first episode does something incredibly smart to help the viewer feel like they are a part of the breakout. And they do it without them actually getting hands-on with it like in the game. Essentially, the entire breakout sequence is shot handheld. This creates the feeling that we're right there with the characters. There's no massive wides of the planes crashing, no drone shots of infected flooding the streets. It's all ground level, even at times replicating Sarah's point of view from inside the truck. This in a way supplemented the active experience of a video game. It made us feel like we were there despite the fact we're not controlling anything. This is why 30 minutes into the opening episode, I knew that this show was going to be something incredible, because it showed straight away that Craig Mazin understands the translation of media. Now that brings me on to one of my major points as to why this show is so great, and it comes down to the fact that the show justifies its own existence. A lot of people when the show was first announced said things like, why do we even need this? The game is a masterpiece, you can't possibly top it, why even bother? And you know what? That's absolutely fair. I even to a degree completely agree with that notion. But the first 2 episodes spoon feed the answer to you on why we did in fact need this adaptation. Because it builds on the perfection of the game. It used a different storytelling medium to shed new light on pre-existing characters. It uses the filmmaking medium to create world building that is simply harder to do in video game format. The addition of Joel drinking his misery away was an amazing addition that the game intentionally avoided. In the game, Joel denies a drink from Tess.
Want one?
No, I don't want one.
In the show, however, Joel drinks himself into a little nappy nap. We also get an extra peek behind the curtain of how the smuggling business works in this world. It all expands on the source material. But in terms of pure character, we see more for each individual. As stated previously, we see a lot more of Sarah in the show than we do in the game. We see more of her bond with her father, despite the fact that Joel is not exactly the world's #1 dad. He's a good father, sure, and he cares about Sarah, but he makes a lot of mistakes. Joel himself, I'd argue, they actually made him even more likable pre-Outbreak than he is in the game. We see more of his downsides, but we also see just a little bit more of the closer side of his and Sarah's relationship. Even Tommy gets more to do in the show's opening sequence. And he even gets locked up in a county jail as opposed to just being the guy that saves Joel and Sarah a couple times like in the game. And even once we skip ahead 20 years, we see more of Tess and Joel's relationship. In the game, it's alluded to that they're together, but the show goes, no, we aren't beating around the bush here, they are together. And given how things pan out for this story, that's an incredibly smart decision that again justifies why they're telling this story in the first place. We even get to see more of Ellie and Marlene, which was skimmed over in the game. I didn't really give a shit about Marlene in the game, but in the show, one brief moment made me 10 times more invested in her as a character. And that is when Joel has his gun pointed at Ellie.
Go.
Not at her. Pointed at me.
This was a really clever way to add more depth to the character than was present in the game, and it's done very briefly, yet it's done very effectively. It's these small moments that The Last of Us excels in with adding more depth to pre-existing characters. But we got to talk about Ellie. As I mentioned before, I had some small concerns for this show before it came out. One of those concerns being no spores, the other was Ellie. From what I saw before the show released, I was like, I don't know about Bella Ramsey as Ellie. She just didn't really look like Ellie. Whereas I see Pedro Pascal as Joel and I completely buy it, like that is Joel. But with Bella Ramsey, I just didn't see that. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those idiots that didn't know anything about the actress. I knew she was talented, I'd seen her in Game of Thrones and she was great. But she just didn't give me that Ellie vibe initially. But I was blown away by how, despite looking nothing like Ellie from the games, Bella Ramsey completely embodied the very essence of Ellie. In the games, Ellie, she's a smartass, she acts above her years, she's got a foul mouth, but she's really likable. Bella Ramsey embodies that side of Ellie so well that the appearance literally just does not matter. It's completely irrelevant. I will say I still prefer Ellie from the games a lot more than I do in the show, but that could of course change as the season goes on. I will say though, I think Pedro Pascal's Joel, I might actually just come out and say, I think I actually prefer Joel in the show than I do in the game. I know that's going to get people really pissed off with me, but I don't know, bring the pitchforks out, man, I'm ready. But as for Ellie, I was very surprised how Bella Ramsey fully embodied the character. Her take on the character nails the major beats of Ellie in the game, but the show's version is slightly rougher around the edges with a lot of room to grow. Now look, we often see in video game adaptations that characters just aren't what they are in the game. They try so hard in replicating what's in the game with these characters that they just feel nothing like them at all. On rare occasions, this works, but most of the time, it doesn't. Take 2021's Mortal Kombat, for example. Kano, they really tried to make him feel like he was straight from the games, and it worked. The dude was great, and he stole the show.
Top knot. The end. What's his name? Kung Pao. Pass us a fucking egg roll, would you?
But virtually every other character, maybe except for a few, it just didn't work. At no point watching that film did I go, yep, that is Liu Kang. Yep, that's Shang Tsung. Yep, that's Raiden. No. The Last of Us has no such issue, and it all comes down to one word: balance. Balance is something this show does incredibly well. It doesn't try too hard to bring these pre-existing characters to life, like so many video game adaptations try to do. Instead, it feels like they've struck a great balance of what made the character so endearing to those who had played the game, but also injecting something new that works for this interpretation. A lot of people originally criticized Craig Mazin for asking the actors to not play the game so they don't imitate the characters that they're playing, but his method, you can't really argue with it now. At no point did I ever feel like Pedro Pascal was trying to replicate Troy Baker. At no point did I feel like Bella Ramsey was trying to replicate Ashley Johnson. It all feels natural. It feels new, but it also feels the same. It's honestly remarkable the balance that they struck bringing these characters to life. The changes they made with the characters don't feel like change for the sake of change. Every alteration feels meaningful and serves the characters for this version of the story. When it comes to The Last of Us, character is the most important thing. The story of The Last of Us is incredibly simple and something you've probably seen before, with some exceptions. But the strength and magic of that game was never the story itself necessarily. It's not exactly a groundbreaking story. A very good one, yes, absolutely. But that's not what made the game so great. It was the characters within that story. If they couldn't translate the characters from the game to the screen, then this show was never going to work. Thankfully though, there is no such issue with The Last of Us show. The characters are just as strong as the game. Episode 2 essentially follows up and complements the first in every single way. I'd argue the second episode is actually better than the first. And it helps the show continue on its way of an arguably flawless adaptation. We spoke earlier about how this show uses its flashback scenes to incredible effect. The first episode's interview sequence was a perfect addition to the adaptation. The second episode, however, I'd argue done it even better. The flashback to Jakarta, which was briefly referenced in the pilot, this gives us 10 times more insight to this world and the fungus itself than the game ever did. Again, that's not a knock on the game, it's just an example of knowing what to add and take away from an already perfect source material. It was pretty intense seeing all this play out because let's be honest, whilst not to the same degree, this sequence sort of gives us kind of flashbacks to 2020. Obviously, I'm being a little dramatic here, but that same sense of dread was evoked from the show detailing ground zero for the outbreak. As mentioned earlier, the Chernobyl vibe of the show's creator is once again prevalent here. Everything down to the camera movement, even the color grading, recaptures that feeling of dread, terror, and impending doom for so many people. The final scene of the Jakarta flashback was masterfully created from start to finish. The slow push in of the camera as the dialogue becomes increasingly disturbing. It perfectly captures the sheer terror of the moment. From the start of the scene, we go from relative hope of a cure to the certain doom of humanity. All of that in a near unbroken push in toward the Doctor. Easily one of my favorite scenes of the show. And this was never in the game to begin with. Again, it's addition that's actually surpassing what came before. Again, it just proves that Mazin and Druckmann knew what to add to this story. And it's a prime example of conveying messages to the audience through cinematography. Like these flashback sequences in this show, man.
Perfect.
But masterful flashbacks aside, we still have an equally incredible show building around it. Much like the first episode, the follow-up continued with its near identical adaptation, but had so many moments that send the story in a slightly new direction. And also moments that just help build the world around it more than the game ever did. The show continues where the pilot left off, with Joel and Tess still incredibly and understandably cautious of Ellie. Now, as the audience, we can probably sit here and armchair expert the situation and be like, oh, of course she's not going to turn, it would have happened by now, like relax. But Joel and Tess are still very cautious of Ellie for good reason. This is 20 years after the outbreak. Joel and Tess are still alive for a reason. There's the idea that in this world you can hang onto your morals and die or do what you need to do to survive. So most of the people left in this world are not exactly good people. They're people that have murdered, stolen, done everything they can to survive. No matter how morally bankrupt they've become, no matter how far they've distanced themselves from their own humanity, these people are alive for a reason. So I loved the small detail that Joel and Tess weren't so quick to drop their guard toward Ellie until further into the episode. Now, we got to talk about this hive mind idea that the show takes on, because for those of you who haven't played the game, this is not in the game. This is an entirely new idea for the show, in a way to supplement the emission of spores. You know, as if this world wasn't already terrifying enough. Mason and Druckmann decided that the fungus grows everywhere, even underground, so if you step on cordyceps in one place, infected a mile away can know, which apparently plays into a real-life aspect of fungus that Mason and Druckmann researched and incorporated into the show. And the way this plays into the climax of the episode and the death of Tess, I'm just going to say it, it was better than it was in the game. Tess's death in this show is better than the game. Although her dialogue is virtually identical, the idea that it's a horde running toward them as opposed to humans just adds more direness to the situation. Plus, it gives extra insight into the infected, how they work, as well as creating one of the most disturbing things I have ever seen. Wow. Now, on the subject of Tess, this was another aspect of the show that I think actually surpassed the game. Anna Torv overall crushed this role, and the small dialogue additions given to Ellie and Tess helped to create some form of an attachment to one another. This helped add more weight to the situation at the end of the episode when it's revealed that Tess is infected. Both Joel and Ellie have stakes in the goodbye, and this perfectly illustrates the dichotomy of Joel and Ellie. Joel, despite being incredibly close to Tess, handles the situation like, let's be honest, an absolute Chad. Whilst he's visually disturbed and clearly uncomfortable with the idea of leaving her behind to die, he's incredibly cold about it and understands that it has to be done. Whereas Ellie, despite knowing Tess for all of one day, seemingly struggles more with leaving her behind. This helps highlight how morally bankrupt Joel is. What this world has done to his humanity. Whereas Ellie has the benefit of growing up in the QZ, she's had the benefit of a child's innocence and doesn't really understand what it takes to stay alive in this world. It really is great to see that the show is staying true to key character beats that made the game so great in the first place, but it's still using the medium to build on what was already there. And I have to mention the small details that just open up so many cans of worms with these characters. The blink and you'll miss it line of Tess telling Joel that he never asked him to feel the same way she felt.
Ask you for anything, not to feel the way I felt, not to you shut the fuck up because I don't have time.
This basically tells us that although Joel and Tess are close and together, he never really let his wall down after Sarah's loss. Not even for someone that he grew that close with. This just again expands Joel's character, and to be honest, I didn't even pick up on it the first time I watched it. There is just so much value in the small moments in this show that can be easily overlooked. There is an attention to detail and element of care in this show that so many major shows and films these days just lack. It's honestly refreshing. But let's stray away from that for a second and let's talk about clickers. These things had to be adapted perfectly, and they were. The incredible design was essentially copy and pasted from the game, as well as the audio. So although visually the clickers are identical to the way they look and sound in the game, they've been slightly changed to fit in with the more realistic approach of the show. In the game, you can walk into an area with 6 clickers and 5 runners and walk out alive. It seems that approach has been changed in the show, with 2 clickers being almost too much for Joel and Tess. And as I touched on earlier, the sound design of this show was on full display here. The sound design in the game was probably the best of maybe any game I've played, and the show has clearly gone out of its way to make sure that it's up to par. It's not just the sound design though, the production design is just as stellar. The look and feel of this world is so well translated to screen. The first episode had incredible moments from the game directly translated into the show. But the second episode kicked it up a notch. The hotel scene, I mean, just look at this. Now I have to touch on fan service. There is a lot here for fans of the game, whether it's locations, dialogue, specifically with Ellie.
Boyfriend.
I'm an orphan and no.
Honestly though, these first 2 episodes overall were simply perfect. The worst thing about this show is that, you know, there was maybe one shot where the green screen wasn't great. But honestly, the true worst thing is that I have to wait a week for the next episode. Overall though, The Last of Us is just absolutely destroying the competition of video game adaptations so far. The incredibly faithful yet fresh adaptation is shaping to be one for the ages. After the garbage of Uncharted last year, it's great to see this IP treated so well. We live in a time where established IPs are absolutely shat on by its creators because they just refuse to actually tell a good story. But I mean, it's just refreshing to see an established IP come along, get treated right, that puts the story and characters first, that has something to say, but does it in service to the story and its characters, not to the detriment of them. It feels like Mazin and Druckmann really wanted to tell you this story and tell it right, not drag legacy characters through the mud, not to alter things that completely defeat the purpose of telling the story in the first place. This is just a perfect adaptation of what is arguably the greatest video game of all time, and is well on its way in not just breaking the video game curse, but burying it for good. The Last of Us is without a doubt, as it stands right now, the best video game adaptation we have seen across film and television. And I know people are going to make a case for animation being the best, whether it's Arcane or something like that. But live action wise, it's undisputed, I think. The attention to detail, the emphasis on character over fan service, granted there is, again, plenty of fan service, but it doesn't beat you over the head with it. It's tastefully done in a faithful retelling that isn't afraid to change elements to fit the medium that it's telling the story in. The Last of Us feels like a show made with care, a high quality drama that takes itself seriously and doesn't treat its audience like children. If The Last of Us can keep this up, it can absolutely be one of the greatest shows of recent memory, which is impressive given that dark shadow that tends to follow video game adaptations. Now, just before I end this video, I don't normally do this, but I just want to say, if you guys are new around here, feel free to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth video essays like this. I've got some pretty cool announcements that I'll be rolling out over the course of this year as we hit certain milestones. The channel has gone from nothing to something in the course of 4 to 5 months, and this is just the beginning. So be sure to subscribe to the channel as we gear up for a massive 2023. But until next time, thanks for watching.